Welcome, everybody, to Ghostlight. I'm your host, Benjamin Reed, and every week I sit down with artists and builders to talk about the practical side of creative living, how to survive, adapt, and thrive in the performing arts and beyond. And today I am joined by a good friend and artist, Jonathan Spivey. Jonathan, welcome.
Hey, thank you. How's it going?
It's going good. Thank you very much for being here.
Sure thing.
So, Jonathan, if you and I did not just work together at the Virginia Repertory Theater and we bumped into each other at a cocktail party, tell me, how would you describe what you do?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I talk a lot. Uh, I would like to say that I listen a lot. That's a vague answer to your question. I am a professional actor. I live in New York. I've lived here 19 years, believe it or not, since 2007. 2 of those years don't count because I was in school in San Diego, but I've been based here for almost 2 decades and have performed in shows both here and in regional theater around the country. And more recently, I'd say the last really post-COVID, I've been doing bits and pieces, a little more TV, a little bit of film too, but still most of my professional experience continues to be performing on stage. As a parallel to that, when I'm not lucky enough to get hired as an actor, which is a constant for most stage actors, I also write. I'm a playwright and also a musician, but I played piano since I was a kid. But both of those have always professionally sort of taken a backseat to my work as a performer, as an actor on stage.
Well, so I'm curious, as someone who has lived in New York City for 19 years, and I do want to get back to your graduate training a little bit later in the episode, but as someone who has established and lived for 19 years in New York City, tell me about your journey from a financial background and how have you found stability over the years in one of the most expensive cities in the world?
Yeah, that financial struggle, not to sound too trite, but that artist struggle or that actor struggle of how to pay the bills. I have gone through that process. Trying to think of what I was doing when I first moved here right after college. The earliest I can remember, the earliest side hustle jobs that sustained me in between performing, can't remember when I jumped into catering. But actually, I remember two. These were bizarre stories. Two fundraising jobs, one for a nonprofit that was cold calling on the telephone. And I turned out to be pretty horrible at that. I tried, but sales is, even though it's related to being an actor, it's not the same. And yeah, what else? There's been so many. They all sort of run together. Catering, honestly, has been one of the largest kind of side hustle jobs that has sustained me in between performing. I haven't done so much of it in the last few years. But one of the reasons why so many New York City based actors rely on that as a source of income is because the scheduling is so incredibly flexible. The hourly pay is not bad for the type of work that you're doing. And because there are, save a couple of times a year, generally shifts available all year round. So up until the last couple of years, that's been a huge part of my annual income to supplement performing. Gosh, I'm also remembering working for the US Census the last round. That was the 2020 census. That was during COVID, knocking on doors. Actually worked on the census 10 years before as an office manager in 2010. You know what? I'm remembering now. When I first finished undergrad, I did a lot of temping, office temping, like in a finance office and in a law firm. And what I found was that those environments, even though I was a temp, didn't give me a huge amount of scheduling flexibility, which when auditions come up very last minute is sort of a necessity. Anyway, all that is to say, the bulk of the first few years I was living here and continuing to leave town to work regional theater, I was largely living paycheck to paycheck. And really only post COVID did I start taking a few financial seminars through an organization now known as the Entertainment Community Fund. You remember them. We did a fundraiser for them during Christmas Carol.
Mm-hmm.
Same organization, but they offer financial literacy seminars for actors and performing arts professionals. I took several of those over COVID, and that honestly, what I feel like personally was the beginning of my financial education. I mean, completely transparent with you, I think I, like a lot of actors, because finances can be so scary, ran away from thinking about them for a very long time, to the extent that, like, during COVID, probably oversharing, but who cares? I think it's valuable information for people to know. I was like 3, 4, 5 years behind on my taxes because I had this panic of like, how am I going to pay what I owe, or am I going to owe? So it's kind of an ostrich with my head in the sand about finances in general. And then the pandemic happened, and so many of us did so much navel gazing during that period and self exploration that I sort of felt like, I have to resolve this. I'm carrying around a huge amount of anxiety, and worked with a professional from the Entertainment Community Fund who helped me get caught up, and hand in hand with taking those seminars, realized like educating yourself actually relieves a lot of that anxiety. I know I've just thrown a lot at you. The other thing I would say is I think artists are often conditioned to think that finances aren't for us. They're for people who are good with numbers or whatever. But I don't believe that that's true. It may not be what interests us, but we absolutely have to get a handle on them, or we're not going to be able to do what we want to do professionally. That was
It
a
sounds
really,
like
yeah,
it sounds like that information that you got from those courses really was like a turning point for you in your journey of kind of stabilizing the basis for your career. Is that inaccurate?
absolutely. Demystifying mutual funds, for example. Or I remember one of the first light bulb moments was learning about what a Roth IRA is and the ramifications tax wise of what contributing to that means versus a traditional IRA or your 401k. And these are not complicated principles. I mean, we have to deal with incredibly complex language in our work all the time. And yeah, I think that was a light bulb moment of realizing it's going to require a little bit of studying, but it's not as complex as we sometimes make it out to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that made me think of just how when you have anxiety about something, your most natural response as a human is to lean away from it and not engage with it. But when you do go and lean into it and engage with it, it's often not nearly as scary or intimidating as you initially thought, right?
Absolutely. When I met with the tax professional who helped me resolve those years where I was behind, I remember so clearly. The first thing she said was, I know you're terrified. The IRS is not a shark that is looking for you and circling you in the water. You have built this up so much more in your head than the actual danger of being behind. So you're doing exactly the right thing by resolving it now. But yeah, I agree with you. The instinct often is to run away rather than to run towards the problem, which of course sometimes ends up overcomplicating the problem.
So, how do you approach finance now and sustainability in the arts moving forward, moving into 2026, 2027?
For me, that's unique to everybody. I think for me, one of the big things that changed, and not to get too personal, but I lost both of my folks in the last few years. They were incredibly financially responsible people. So their passing and their financial responsibility has fortunately not made me Scrooge McDuck whatsoever, but has afforded me absolutely a little bit of a cushion that I didn't have while they were still living. That has relieved some of that financial pressure. And with that, I would say that doesn't mean I'm never going to work a survival job again. In fact, to me, that means I have to treat that sum of money even more responsibly, because that required so much work on their part that I feel this sort of legacy responsibility to them, not to just burn it away or to use it on foolish ends. So for me personally, I can say that has changed some of that sweating and hustle from when I first moved up here. Aside from that, like personal experience, I think for me there has also been a shift in thinking long term, and I know that's a simple thing to say, but to use that Roth IRA as another example, I have to make sure I'm contributing the max to that if I can in each year because I'm paying myself 20, 30 years down the road. So sure, I could take that $7,000 and spend it on something else right now, but I don't know. That's been a mental shift over the last couple of years too. Thinking about it as kind of writing your own paycheck a couple of decades in the future um, has really helped me kind of shift my thinking about it.
Yeah, that's so important. I want to say, I know we've talked about this before, but also sorry for your loss. And,
Thank
uh,
you.
and I think that what you're talking about and being a steward of what they left for you is a very healthy way to approach it. And I think does honor them and their legacy and what they did for you. So happy to hear you speak a little bit about that. My transition, because I lived the actor life, the sort of life of the waif. I never lived in New York City, but I definitely went job to job when I could get the work. And then when the work wasn't there, I went and waited tables. Probably if I had been in New York City, I would have done catering, but it was easy enough to just get a restaurant job for me. And the same thing. I just never really had any kind of financial education. I was never particularly interested in it. And, and I just kind of got by. And it wasn't until I opened our first business that I was sort of forced into a financial education. But it's like, if I were to give advice to any actor starting out, it would be, you've got to learn some of these basics. They're not that hard, right? And you do need to treat your personal finances like a business. And, how much is coming in, how much is going out, and are you thinking in the long term? Because what we, you know, when we're young, we don't have that vision for the future. And yet that's precisely the time where setting up good habits pays off exponentially for
Yeah.
the future self.
I'll also share when we were faced with some of the estate accounting, my mom passed away second, right? And my sister and I were faced with this mountain of paperwork. And our parents, I grew up in Virginia in the South, and I grew up with parents who didn't talk to us about money a lot. They encouraged us to be frugal, but it was one of those topics, just like politics and religion, that it was a social environment where they didn't really talk about numbers with us or even taxes, how to do them. We didn't, it was considered, I guess, generationally impolite to even bring it up. So when we found ourselves with them gone and this mountain of records, it all of a sudden became our job to decipher this kind of mountain of information that we had never even had a conversation with them about, which was daunting. I don't mean to minimize that. And it was very difficult. But one of the great surprises of going through that experience and the estate accounting for the probate process was realizing while I was doing it, I was shocked to realize like I actually enjoyed parts of it. And again, I had always thought of myself as this, I'm an actor. I like words. I'm a right brain artist. But there were pieces of that process where the precision and the simplicity of those columns of numbers was actually a lot more comfortable for me than I expected it to be. So I'd also say that too. I think artists often think we can only be in this one category of what we're good at or what we enjoy. But to your point, I don't think we always give ourselves enough credit either for we're in a profession that requires us to do so many different things and to learn how to do them so quickly. And this is just one other category of skills that we know how to acquire. So, yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, you just hit sort of a part of my soapbox, which is this belief that artists can and should be involved and active in the administration of arts organizations, that we're leaving a lot of value uncovered because we're always being treated as what you just said, people who they don't get that side of things. They don't get the numbers, they don't get the marketing. They're not interested in it. They're, these kind of free spirit artists. But I think the thing that is not true there is that artists are creatives. And if you find your niche inside of the business side of things, there is this incredibly creative component that exists inside of things that don't seem like they're creative, like probate estate accounting, right? And so if we could tap into that and unlock the creativity of these people, I think we could find a lot more inroads to creating value for people.
This might sound crazy too, but there were parts of that process, which again was difficult in some ways, but there were parts of having to do that accounting, again, to just use that as one example, where conversely, I also thought regularly, I don't know how in this moment this is going to become useful to me as an artist, but I know at some point I'm going to do a play or a TV show, or I'm going to play some role that involves a character that has had to go through this experience. And without me going through this experience, which at times feels like I don't want to do this, that is going to afford me a better understanding of what that character is experiencing in the future. So that was also at some points my kind of Pollyanna way of trying to make the best of a process that didn't always feel fun. Yeah, I feel like at some point it's going to become useful in that way too.
Yeah. Yeah, when you speak of it that way, it's kind of hard to imagine any experience in life that couldn't lend itself to your artistic expression, right?
Absolutely. I mean, in those really difficult moments, it can be hard to remember that, but I do try to remind myself of that regularly. If the subway is 20 minutes late and you're sitting on the platform and you're like, "Oh my gosh, why is the universe doing this to me today?" I try to remind myself, "Hey, this is going to be useful to you as an artist at some point, even though it doesn't feel like that right now. It will be. It will be."
There's a guy, I think his name is Peter Crone. He's called the Mind Architect. And he's motivational coach, writer, guru type. But he has this quote that I love, which is, "What happened, happened, and it couldn't have happened any other way because it didn't."
I love it. Very
Yeah, it's
zen.
just, it's very zen. And I do find myself going back to it. And I even recently have started putting it into future tense as well. What happens will happen, and it can't happen any other way because it won't. Like, just, be present in the moment, be a part of this sort of what I think of as a collaboration with the universe, with the divine, and take what comes to you and try to make the best of it.
Yeah, that's such an important lesson. And I would like to think that's becoming a little bit easier for me with age, but it's still a struggle. And yes, I've spent so many years, I think, particularly of myself as a young adult, where I railed against what was happening or, of course, wished it was happening in a different way. And I agree, you come to a point where you realize, well, I can continue through living out those frustrations, or I can adjust my reaction, because at the end of the day, that's often one of the only things that we have control over, to all these other things that I don't have control over. So we're getting very deep. We're getting so deep.
Well, I think it does tie back though to, if other actors or creatives are listening to this, it just ties back to controlling the controllables. Don't focus on the things that are out of your control. And for as actors, one of those things is auditions and the parts that you get. Like, you you don't know if you're the right fit. You don't know why you weren't the right fit. You don't know, so you just have to trust that you get the jobs that are yours and you don't get the jobs that aren't.
Yeah. I mean, that continues to be a challenge, but that is, I would say, the biggest challenge of doing this profession long term is learning to and practicing letting go of all of those parts of why you didn't get a job and not spending too much time worrying about those because this profession is for so many reasons. It's not a meritocracy. So often the best artist doesn't get hired. But even in saying that, best is a subjective word. We work in a subjective industry that is based on people's opinions of our artistry. So it's not as if there's one be all end all authority that says this actor is better than the other or more skilled. But yeah, all those pieces that are out of our control. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still a big challenge, but the other thing I tell friends regularly who will say, "Hey, I just got out of this callback and I nailed it," or "Hey, I just got out of this audition and I bombed." I tell them so often, your feeling about what you did in the room is important for you to register, but really has nothing to do with what the outcome of that audition was going to be. And often maybe in direct contrast to what they felt behind the table or they thought. So, for example, if you got the tears welling up in your scene and you thought you were brilliant, great, happy for you, but that's something completely separate from who they're going to hire. They're just two independent things. And that approach has become valuable for me to sort of separate like, well, I'm allowed to feel that I did a great job in an audition, but I also have to accept the fact that like that has nothing to do with who they're going to hire. It really, they're two separate things. Yeah, all I've tried to do, actually a little more over the past year is, and this is recent, it sounds so basic, and I probably should have been doing it a lot more before, but, like, to come up with a routine or something that I know will calm me down before I walk into the audition room. For me, that's, like, listening to music, which sounds so like, "Jonathan, why weren't you already doing this?" But instead of being so trapped in my head before I walk in there to have something else to focus on. But yeah, there's so many variables that are out of our control. And in this job, you just have to kind of learn to be at peace with that, or you're not going to be able to sustain the profession.
Hey, y'all. If you're enjoying this conversation, I want to invite you to be a part of what we're building. Visit stageable.com and join the email list. That's where we'll share new conversations, ideas, and the progress of the project. And if you'd like to help more people discover Ghostlight, follow the show or leave a review on your favorite podcast app. Now, back to the conversation. So tell me a little bit about your process now with your approach to auditions and what jobs you take, what jobs you go after. Are you still out there searching for jobs, or is your agent bringing them to you?
It's both. I'm out there. Yes, I'm looking multiple times a week. For me right now, that means like on Actors Access. And I self submit there regularly, but I'm also lucky I have an agent here in New York who gets me appointments for projects that I might not already be aware of. But I think for most actors, even those who are more established than me, that have been doing it longer, that have bigger credits, that have, worked at places that I would love to, but haven't yet, it's all still a mix of your agent getting you appointments, but also you chasing down work yourself. I would not say when folks ask me what kind of work are you looking for right now, or what kind of like performance opportunities are you focused on right now? My joke is usually, well, what do people want to hire me to do? And I say that somewhat facetiously, but I do believe there's this misconception among folks who aren't actors, who haven't done it long term, that we have a lot more selectivity about the type of work that we do than we actually have. And that's cyclical too. I mean, there's been seasons where I'm like, whoa, I'm auditioning for like so much television this year. Super exciting. And then there are years where you're not. And yeah, in that respect, it's kind of like it's a marriage of both. Like, what am I interested in auditioning for? But also what opportunities are available this year or this season. It's a little bit of both. I know I've sort of dodged that question, but honestly, I'd say I don't avoid musicals at all. I do them selectively. I can sing. but I don't chase after those as much because I am just artistically more interested in straight plays. But I do them from time to time. And I like to say I kind of vacation in musical theater. I like to do like one every year, year and a half, 2 years, just to sort of keep the skill developed. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's about both seeking out my own opportunities and auditioning for the material that my agent sends me. Um, so it's a little mix of both.
What have you had any jobs that you've turned down just because they were not the right fit, or is it?
Sure. Yeah, I've been fortunate that there's been a handful of times where dates don't line up. So you have to choose between one job or another. I've also had it happen where you have accepted a job that's, let's say, a couple months down the road that's not paying very well, perhaps out of town, far away. And then a job here in New York comes up that's incredibly lucrative
Mhm.
and more creatively fulfilling. So yes, I've had it happen where you sort of have to leave one opportunity for another. Of course, it always feels like torture when that happens, because whenever that happens, I always think about all those gaps where you're begging for work and it feels like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get hired again. And I always think in those situations where two jobs conflict with one another, I'm like, could not this have just happened like 3 months later so that I've done both, but you can't control the timing of things. But yeah, and there have been auditions that I have declined because it felt like, oh, I'm going to be away from home for way too long, or or really feel like even though I don't have this specific show on my resume, I feel like I've kind of already done this show several times. So, in a more general sense, aside from having to be an opportunist, like I was just describing, I would say with a few years under my belt now, I am, I guess you could say, more selective than I was when I was like 20 or 25.
Mhm.
Because when you're just starting out,
You just
you
take
kind
everything
of
you get.
have to say yes to everything that people are asking you to do. You
Mhm.
have to, because you're trying to meet people and you're trying to build up your resume. And as those years progress and more of your life circumstances become a part of the decision making, I think it's natural as you get older to turn some opportunities down.
Yeah, and Bogart has that great quote about how making a choice is a violent act because it destroys the possibility of every other choice. And I always remember that from my Masters of Fine Arts days and my artist education. And it's funny because it's a very old concept in business, and it's basically opportunity cost, right? If you say yes to this, it means you're saying no to every other possibility that's out there. And so every time you take a job, you're now saying for this time frame, I, I can't do anything else.
I literally just had that conversation with a really old friend of mine from college who was on the fence about, should I take this contract that's several months out of town? I don't know. And that's exactly the advice that I gave him. I said, I can't tell you whether you should take one job or another, but know that if you make the decision to go do that, you are closing the window to every other opportunity that would happen, even though you don't know what those opportunities would be yet.
Hmm.
But you are saying no to those other things. And even though those other options are a mystery to you right now, you don't know what they are. You are choosing this instead of those.
Hmm.
So, to that extent, sometimes it feels like a gamble. It's like, well, I'm not going to audition for this project for XYZ reason, but I'm going to spin the wheel on something else coming up at the same time, even though I don't know what it might be yet.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a very mature artist who has that kind of awareness and foresight to make those, at least be aware that they're making that trade-off. You might still choose to go take the gig because you need a gig and you haven't worked in a while, and so you just decide to go do it. But I think just being aware that there's a trade-off that takes place here, and I'm choosing that intentionally.
He did end up taking the gig, by the way.
There we go. Sometimes a gig is better than no gig, or, a gig is better than the possibility of a different, better gig. So, as a professional storyteller, I was wondering if there were some lessons from your graduate program that have stuck with you in your career. I mean, what did you learn in grad school that helped you craft better stories?
I went to the Old Globe in San Diego, which is largely a Shakespeare-based program. You don't just study Shakespeare, but you largely study Shakespeare. And one of the big reasons I decided to go, I didn't audition for any other grad program. They found me at an EPA for their summer, and I sort of fell into grad school in that way. But one of the ideas that really sold me on going, I think I was 27 when I started that training there, was okay, I know I don't want to just do Shakespeare for the rest of my professional life, but if I can get a grasp on this language that is incredibly complex and hard to do, I would hope that that facility with that complex language would allow me to handle any other playwright more easily. And I feel like that's one of the biggest skills that I was able to develop while I was there. Text analysis, I think, was big and is probably one thing that I kept from there that has served me honestly with any other playwright you can work with or perform. I also think text analysis, even though folks might not label it that with those words, is one of the most underappreciated and looked over parts of an actor's toolkit that really separates actors who do it really well from actors who are just okay. It's that
So,
step.
tell me about what that looks like in practical terms for you. I mean, like, because you get a script, what are you doing with it? Are you taking pencil to paper? Are you jotting down notes? Are you breaking it up? Are you looking for clues? Like, what is your process like?
Usually I'm getting the sides for the audition first, and this sounds fundamental, but if it's a project I'm really interested in and I just get the sides or the scenes that I'm auditioning with, and I have not gotten the full script yet, the first thing I do is to write my agent or the decision maker and to ask for the full script. That sounds fundamental. A lot of actors don't even think about that because I not only want to read the material that they're asking me to prepare, but I also want to see how do those scenes, how does this character fit into the framework of the larger story? That's a big part of it. Now, I say that knowing that depends on how much time you have for the audition. So that doesn't always mean I can sit and pour over the entire script, but I will absolutely, if I'm really limited, I will at least skim it to know what's the general shape of the story. Those are usually the first couple steps. Then when I am at a point of getting ready to memorize, I'm looking at this, let me grab them. This is usually my next step if I'm preparing to memorize like even just for an audition, I am a note card like person. So this is one format. I will write the cue line for me. That's always on the lined side of the 3x5 card. And then my line on the back. And then I have a stack of note cards I can walk around with me to drill just like I was learning, learning the things I had to memorize for a class.
Yeah.
That's usually step two. And then for me, I also have an app on my phone that is audio based. So it's an app that allows you to record the cue line and then, you say your line and I usually have that in my ear. So I think for me, I've learned that like the act of writing it down physically really helps lock in the lines and then hearing them with the cues also helps. Anyway, the text analysis question though, it's reading the scenes that I have to prepare, getting a general idea of the story through the script. I would say the next step, just like Shakespeare, is identifying the words or the ideas that I don't know.
Hmm.
Again, that sounds super basic, but like you have to be crystal clear about what every single word means. And if you don't know, a lot of times that means looking it up in the dictionary or finding other references that will help you understand the meaning of every single word that you're saying. Again, it sounds fundamental, but like these are simple steps that I think can feel academic and boring sometimes at the front end of a process, but so make your job easier
They're
when
so
you're ready.
simple, but they get skipped. That's, I think, what happens is because it seems so basic, we're like, oh, I don't really need. I think I kind of get the context and understand ish what they're using that word for. So I'll skip that step. Right.
Yes. And then you end up with a production where not only the actors don't really know what they're saying, but of course, if the actors don't know what they're saying, there is no way that the audience, through osmosis or telekinesis or whatever, are going to like decipher meaning that the actors aren't crystal clear on. Anyway, I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons from that training, too, is the responsibility of the actor to know the meaning of everything that they have to say. Otherwise, the audience is never going to.
Yeah. Well, so that led me to another thing I wanted to discuss with you because you and I are friends and we're in an ensemble together and we're both actors. So this is, we like to talk about shows we've seen. And I've noticed with a lot of my friends who are performers that when we talk about other shows, it feels like a lot of the time productions fall short, right? Like it just didn't feel like it connected. It didn't resonate. And I'm wondering maybe, if you and I can kind of decipher why is that? Why does it feel like we're walking out of theaters going, it just didn't seem to connect?
Think that's a great question. And I think for me, it kind of depends on the genre of show that you're seeing. So if it's a language based show like Shakespeare or like Arthur Miller or Tennessee Williams or George Bernard Shaw or any of those other plays where the language is the star of the show. Yeah, I think often the reason why it doesn't land with an audience to me, it's partly what I just said, is because the actors aren't 100% clear of what they're saying. One of the things I see in Shakespeare a lot, and I complain about this to friends all the time, and I talk about this when I coach Shakespeare too, is one of the first steps when you're breaking down complex language that you're going to have to do in a scene is to identify the most important words. You and I have talked about this too.
Hmm.
Identifying those operatives, right? Naming what the most important words in a line or a speech are. But then for me, the step after that, that I think often gets overlooked later in the process is then what I would call throwing away a lot of the language that isn't as important as those words that are. Because, and I just saw a production, which I will not name, in the last couple of weeks where this was one of the real challenges of hearing the words. Every word in most of those lines was equally important, so the audience couldn't hear what wasn't important. And consequently, it becomes very tough as an audience member to know what you need to hear versus what isn't quite as important. So I tell folks, especially young people who are working on a soliloquy for the first time, after you've identified that handful of words that the audience really needs to hear, you got to throw a lot of the rest of it away. And that
Hmm.
feels like such a loss sometimes of all the effort you put in. It feels like, wait, I spent hours making sure I so intimately understand this language. But if you don't go through that part of the process, if you aren't willing to make some sections of the speech less important than others, the audience doesn't know what they need to hear. And I see that all the time and hear that all the time where the actors are chewing each piece of the language so much, the audience doesn't know what they need to listen to. So that I think is a huge downfall often with plays with complex language.
If everything is important, nothing is.
Yeah, and again, it sounds so simple, but it can be really hard, even for me. It can be hard to throw away or to do what feels like throwing away all that effort. But if you don't, then you're taking importance away from those sections and those words that are. You're not lifting those in a way that the audience knows that that's what they need to hear. that's a piece of what I think a lot of those productions have gone south because of pace. I mean, again, super simplistic, but pace and picking up cues, gosh, that's so important. When I go back and look at my notes, because I don't keep all of them, but I keep many of the notes that I take during a rehearsal process just to look back and see how much of an idiot I was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, right? When I look at those rehearsal notes from this production of Arcadia, virtually 75% of the notes that the director gave me were, that was a great moment. That was a great bit or beat. Do it on the line instead of in between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost all the notes from that rehearsal process. So I think about that a lot now too. You see an actor who's making brilliant choices, but they're building in time for those brilliant choices in between the words, when often those choices could be done while they're saying the words instead of in between lines. It's the two of the biggest pratfalls, or I keep saying pratfall, two of the biggest stumbling
Pit
blocks that I think of.
pitfalls. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's so true. I do think all right. So in our businesses, there's a bunch of culture work that I've been painstakingly trying to boil down and make it as simple as possible so that I can communicate it as clearly as possible, which is very difficult to do, to get the entire organization kind of on the same page. Our purpose in our business is, I tried to get it down to basically 3 words. There's another little one in there, but it's craft a better story. And so even though we have a burger concept, we have a wine and beer, we also have accommodations, a small Airbnb. For one, I needed something that tied everything together. And so story really became that thing. It also connects to my wife and I, our background and our training. And a lot of the people in our businesses were from the theater world, and are artists, actively are artists. But what it did is it forced me to think a lot about, okay, well, what is a good story? What does that mean? And there are 4 C words that I use within our organization. And is it clear? Is it consistent? Is it compelling? And is it concise? And man, what you were touching on, it feels like, man, is that last one not the one that we miss so frequently in theater? And it reminds me of a guy I worked with, Gus K. Conan, who directed me in a production of Crucible. And he had this great quote that said, "Our job is to tell the longest story possible in the shortest amount of time."
Mm.
And that has stuck with me. And I do feel like we often have things that are extraneous, that are not needed to tell a clear, consistent, compelling story. They're actually pulling us away from those things because they're unnecessary.
I agree. Yeah. You're reminding me, when I go back and think of some performances that I gave when I was 20 or 25, I kind of want to throw myself off of a bridge, because I'm like, gosh, you felt so compelled to show every skill that you had in every play that you were doing, because I don't know why, because because you felt like you had more to prove at that point, but also because you weren't thinking of how you were approaching this role as how that one character fits into the whole audience experience. You were focused on, I have to make sure that the audience is aware that I'm able to do this and this and this and this and this, rather than, oh, you're serving the story. You're not here to make sure they remember that you have those skills. You're here to make sure that this story has a larger impact on them. I think that's a common trajectory for actors, though. As you age, you end up feeling like, less I need to show everything I'm capable of in every single performance. But that's a lot harder when you're younger, and when you want to make sure that folks know what you're capable of.
I would say it's the number one note, when Lauren and I go and see a show and we walk out and we're talking about, we're in the car on the way home and talking about the production. I almost always am like, the actors could have done less. They were trying to
Mm.
do, they were just doing too much. Like they were trying to do more than they needed to do in order to serve the story, which I think totally connects with what you were just saying.
Now, this is a pivot, but the flip side of that, I think, is I've seen just as many plays that were not great or musicals that were not great, where I walked out thinking, gosh, those actors were fantastic. Those poor performers were stuck with material that was not ready. And that would be my
Mm,
other umbrella. I have seen just as many shows that I think did not fulfill what they could have been. Be- they were in a rush to be put into production and have money thrown at them before the language and the script, etc., were ready for that phase of production. I've seen it so many times regionally, but especially here, where you sit down and let's use like a huge musical as an example. You sit down, it starts, you're halfway through the first act, and the realization starts of like, these performers are incredible, but they have been handed material that is still should be in the editing phase. But for whatever reason, this production team got so excited to put it on its feet and throw $10 million at it that
mm,
they skipped over that editing phase. And it blows my mind every time I see that happen. Sometimes it's because those production teams are in a hurry. Unfortunately, I think sometimes it's also because maybe the folks, the writers and or the editors are resistant to getting in there and doing the editing that needs to be done on the piece. But I think that's the flip side of some of what you're describing, where sometimes I walk away feeling like those actors were incredible, but they deserved better material and they had to
mm.
do what they could with what they were given.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think, we've got to start with a great script. And I think, you know, too often we're starting with scripts that are not quite there yet, that maybe they have greatness within them, but they're missing the structure, they're missing that kind of awareness of what's going to hold an audience's attention, the writing that's going to give actors the ability to have performances that are compelling and that do push the story and the narrative forward. And most of the time, that is completely outside of our realm of influence.
Yes, you're right. I mean, I will say yes, most of the time. I've been in script development rooms though, where you're doing table reads working up to a full production. And I've been in just about every version you can imagine where the playwright is really open to hearing actor feedback, where the playwright clearly doesn't want to hear any actor feedback, where the actor is screaming at the playwright about feedback that they feel like they should be getting, but the playwright doesn't want to hear it. I've been in every version of that. And I would say the ones to me that seem most productive, I'm going to pat us as actors on the back a little bit. I think actors often have some of the best feedback that a playwright could hear. And I'm now thinking of myself in a writing capacity. Like I chase after that feedback from performers regularly because it's so valuable. I don't know. Actors often have really great ideas about the script. That's not to say that playwrights have to implement every single idea. You have to be selective. But yeah, the processes I've been a part of that have gone the best is when the writer is at least willing to hear the feedback of the performers who are speaking the language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the performers they're like the specialists of the character, right? Like the playwright is trying to keep the big picture in mind and the arc of the narrative, but no one is going to get into the nitty gritty of who this individual character is in this world in quite the same way as an actor will.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. We've joked about this too. I feel a little bit cursed at some points as a performer because part of my brain is always on the greater whole. I would call that director brain. Part of my brain is always thinking about like the larger story. And at some points, I wished I could flip that part of my brain off so I can just live in the character. But yeah, nobody's going to know the inside of experience of that character better than the person who's playing that part.
Yeah, but that's such an important balance to strike. You do have to, you can go way the wrong direction there where, you know, you're so focused on your character and what the arc is for your person that you can absolutely miss the forest for the trees about what's going on in the greater play. And it's like, oh, you know what, this actually is not that important. I'm going to focus on making sure I'm in support of the story we're really telling here.
Yeah, you know, and you're reminding me in a more general sense, I think doing that Shakespeare in some of my training phases, Shakespeare plays are kind of structured that way too, where there's a handful of really large roles, there's a handful of supporting roles, and there are a lot of people that walk on and say a few things. And that regional theater movement that is now unfortunately practically dead, but was thriving for a very long time, often cast actors who were doing repertory theater and rotating between those three categories of roles. And
Hmm.
I think not only does that give you an appreciation for the work that each of those types of roles requires, but it also reminds you that, yes, we've got to hear and understand everything King Lear says, but like those people that walk on and say one or two things are often delivering the most important piece of information in the scene.
Hmm.
And in that
Yeah.
respect, are absolutely huge, as important, sometimes more um, than other roles we might think of first.
They're often like delivering some of the biggest changes and shit, like dynamic shifts, right? What came to mind for me was at the end of Mr. Scottish play Mackers, when the person comes on and says that Lady M has died, right? So he runs on and delivers this critical piece of information that fundamentally shifts everything about his journey up to that point.
Yes, there's absolutely a parallel there, I think, to the TV universe too, where it's not just the series regulars that are important for what the audience is hearing, but often those co-stars, those under fives, are showing up in the form of a prosecutor or a police officer or a doctor or a nurse or a what have you. Structurally, they're serving the same function. Maybe it's expositional, but they're letting the audience know something huge. And that's not always easy. That requires skill too. So I think there's a parallel in those two forms, what you're saying.
Yeah, 100%. All right. Well, Jonathan, let's close out with this. I want to hear about how your definition of good work has changed from early in your career to now.
Oh my gosh. Well, we kind of just talked about it. Think kind of what we were just talking about with a focus more on simplicity and telling the story. I think earlier in my career, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but I was so maybe unawarely focused on making sure that the audience was aware of everything I was capable of. And now I'm trying to focus more on not just simplicity, but no, what do they need to see from me in this specific part or this specific play? You know, I'll also say this because I've been thinking about this a lot while I prepare for rehearsals for the next show. I'm also trying to focus on the last, I'd say, year. What are the similarities between me, Jonathan, and this character? And that sounds simple, but my jumping off point, even in grad school, was, well, what is he supposed to sound like? What is this character supposed to sound like? Or how is
Hmm.
he supposed to walk? Or to my mind, like all of these things that like aren't who I am. And I've tried to think a little more about lately focusing on the similarities of like, what if he sounded like you? What if
Hmm.
you didn't feel compelled to transform yourself into someone else? But what if you found those pieces of you personally that you feel like might be aligned with this person who is obviously not you? So yeah, that might be one of the more general differences in how I approach material 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, instead of how do I transform myself, how do I reveal myself?
Yeah, and I mean for me specifically, it's a lot vocally. I've started to realize, gosh, you spent over a decade, transforming your voice or highlighting parts of your voice that was sort of maybe a way of you feeling like that this isn't too personal, like, oh, this is a character separate from me. And don't get me wrong, I still do that depending on the form of the play or the role or the style of the production often asks you to do something different. Obviously, like a different dialect if you're doing that in a play. But yeah, lately I've been noticing that as a habit of mine. That's how I phrase it. Like, why are you so focused when you're first learning these lines on how this character is vocally different from you? What if it was vocally you and you used more of your own voice, I guess? And now, like I said, that depends on the genre.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, thanks, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I hope that you will consider coming back on sometime and doing this again.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We will catch you next week on Ghostlight. Thanks for being here.